Okay, sorry. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're on the West Coast like I am. I'm Sandra Graham, and I'm happy to chair this session titled LGBTQ plus and multiracial demographics in women, minorities, and persons with disabilities in science and engineering. WMPD, the acronym, opportunities and challenges. So I'm a professor of human development and psychology in the Department of Education at UCLA. But I'm here today as a member of the board of the Federation of Associations in Brain and Behavioral Sciences, FABBS for short, who's sponsoring this event. And a special thanks to AERA and AAAS for co-sponsoring. So today, if you have attended the sessions, I went to the first one this morning at 8 a.m., and you're hearing about the patterns of representation of women, members of underrepresented groups, and people with disabilities in science and engineering. And this report is produced by the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics at NSF. And the kind of data provided in this report that comes out every 2 years provides us with critical information and informs us about the achievements and the challenges to greater involvement of these groups in science and engineering. So despite the important data provided in this report, there's work to be done in terms of inclusivity in at least 2 areas. First, members of underrepresented groups are presented as monoracial groups, people who self-identify as Black, Latinx, American Indian, or Alaska Natives. Yet among the fastest growing racial and ethnic minoritized groups in this country are people who identify as 2 or more racial ethnic groups. The report thus far has not examined this group. And second, the report focuses on historically marginalized groups in science and engineering. No one would disagree that women, members of underrepresented groups, and people with disabilities are indeed left out. Yet among the most marginalized groups in our country are people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. So our purpose today is to bring attention to these 2 groups who also are likely underrepresented in science and engineering. The problem is we just don't know how much, and we won't know until we start including them in our analyses. So we're really fortunate to have 3 experts today to talk to us about LGBTQ and multiracial individuals and the importance of including them in these studies of underrepresentation in science and engineering. So I'm going to introduce them now. The first presenter is John Freeman. John is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University and director of the Social Cognitive and Neurosciences Lab. His research focuses on the cognitive and neural mechanisms underlying split-second social judgment, stereotyping, and less conscious forms of bias. And he uses a range of techniques from brain imaging to computational modeling and behavioral paradigms. Recently, he's investigated LGBTQ disparities in US STEM education and the workforce, and has published on sexual orientation and gender identity demographic data collection policy implications in the context of STEM institutions and federal agencies. So perfect to be presenting today for us. Our second set of presenters are Adrienne Nishina and Michael Medina. I'll start with Michael. Michael is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Davis. He received his doctorate in education and psychology, the combined program at the University of Michigan, and currently studies ethnic identity development and socialization among youth of color across adolescence. Adrienne Nishina, his co-presenter, is an associate professor in the Department of Human Ecology at University of California at Davis, and she's vice chair of the department. She studies racial ethnic diversity in social environments, such as adolescent peer groups and schools, and the extent to which such environments can result in creativity, flexibility, and other positive outcomes. And Adrienne is an emerging expert on multiracial youth, and she's done some really creative work in this area. And with her colleague, Melissa Witkow, I knew both of them when they were students at UCLA, grad students, and Adrienne, I worked with her as a postdoc at UCLA. They have an excellent paper in Child Development Perspectives on the importance of including multiracial populations with the focus on child development research. So we're really fortunate to have these experts with us today. Each one will be making about a 10-minute presentation We'll start with John, and then the rest of the time will be devoted for questions from the audience. So we're going to ask you to either put your question in the chat or raise your hand using that raise hand function. And Julianne and the staff at FABBS are going to help me navigate the questions. So when we do get to the Q&A, try to keep your questions short because we have a wonderfully large audience today and we want to give everybody an opportunity. Okay, so with that, here we go. John, you're up.
Let me just get my slides going. Can everyone see me and hear and see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, FABBS, for organizing this panel. I think it's such a really important topic. And thanks, Sandra, for the introduction. I'm really excited to share this work with you and have a discussion and get everyone's feedback. So to begin, I study the cognitive and neurobiological mechanisms underlying less conscious forms of bias. And I think my work on the issue of less conscious forms of bias has sort of informed my perspective on the issue of LGBTQ challenges in STEM. So I want to start by noting that LGBTQ disparities in STEM, if and where they exist, hurt scientific progress. Right, so the 1980 Science and Engineering Equal Opportunities Act stated that it is in the national interest to promote the full use of human resources in science and engineering. And if there are challenges or barriers or disparities faced on the basis of gender, on the basis of race or ethnicity, or disability, or also on the basis of sex orientation or gender identity, that's going to not only raise issues of equal opportunity, but represent a waste of STEM talent that hinders US scientific and technological progress. So when we think about the latest estimates of LGBTQ people in the US, which is 5.6% of the US population, and this is substantially larger, roughly 10% or so for say 18 to 37 years of age individuals. This is a substantial portion of the US STEM workforce, right? And so this could be really a challenge, not only for equal opportunity, but also from a STEM talent perspective. So it's really important that we understand what's going on with this population. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is that, the National Science Foundation has not collected sex orientation or gender identity on its national STEM education and workforce survey. So we don't have the official data that can feed into policy to comprehensively and in a nationally representative way understand these issues. Nevertheless, researchers have begun to look at what kind of disparities LGBTQ people might be facing. And estimates suggest that LGBTQ people are 17 to 21% less represented in the STEM workforce than statistically expected based on the prevalence in the US population. And researchers have recently looked to other federal surveys because NSF doesn't collect this information, like the American Community Survey, finding, and the ACS doesn't have a sex orientation measure, but it does allow people to indicate whether they're in an other sex or same-sex couple. And so there's a lot of caveats there. You're only looking at couples. But the American Community Survey shows that men in same-sex couples are less likely to complete an undergraduate STEM degree and be in a STEM occupation relative to men in other sex couples. The same pattern is replicated among sexual minority men, meaning those who identify as gay, bisexual, or queer, versus straight men in the CDC's National Health Interview Survey, which did have an actual sex orientation measure. And when we look at the gap size in STEM bachelor's degrees, it's larger than the racial gap in terms of Black individuals earning fewer STEM degrees than white individuals, but smaller than the gender gap in terms of women earning fewer STEM degrees than men. Researchers have also looked at the undergraduate period, finding that relative to straight men, sexual minority men are 13% more likely to leave STEM for a non-STEM major from freshman to senior year, even though critically, it's the sexual minority men who show greater signs of engagement in STEM in terms of research and lab participation, which may suggest that faculty members and lab members and how they're mentoring and engaging with these students might signal to these students that it's a place where they don't belong. And if we have time, I'm happy to talk about why we might be finding this asymmetry between the sexual minority men, whereas these disparities are not so observed for sexual minority women. Now, other surveys have been conducted which point to serious issues in terms of non-supportive STEM environments that LGBTQ people are encountering. So they encounter more negative workplace experiences than non-LGBTQ people in STEM, and even than their LGBTQ counterparts in non-STEM industries. Their LGBTQ people in STEM are more likely to experience career barriers, harassment, and professional devaluation. Roughly 70% of sexual minority STEM faculty members who are out at work report feeling uncomfortable in their department. More than 40% of LGBTQ people in STEM are not out to colleagues. And in US physics, 21% of LGBTQ people reported being excluded, intimidated, or harassed at work due to being LGBTQ, and 75% reporting feeling uncomfortable at work, and these predicted a desire to leave STEM. Now, happy to, when we get into discussion, talk about the plausible factors that might be driving these disparities. I'll just briefly mention them here. Anti-LGBTQ bias and discrimination. There's still plenty of that going on in the United States and in the general workforce. STEM stereotypes in terms of beliefs and expectations that the ideal scientist is masculine, heterosexual, and cisgender. And it's these masculine STEM stereotypes in particular that might be explaining the asymmetry between sexual minority men versus sexual minority women. There's considerable research on this topic in terms of women in STEM, and happy to talk about this later. And then also unique STEM norms of impersonality that might be isolating LGBTQ people and preventing them from finding peers and role models, which we know to be so key to the retention of underrepresented individuals in STEM. So what can we do about this accumulating evidence of LGBTQ disparities in STEM? Well, the first step is getting official nationwide data on the topic, which starts with NSF, National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics surveys, the surveys that feed into the WMPD report that we're all talking about today. And these include the National Survey of College Graduates, which is a biennial nationally representative survey of 164,000 bachelor degree recipients across all fields, conducted by the US Census Bureau on behalf of NCSES. The Survey of Doctorate Recipients, which is a biennial nationally representative survey of 120,000 PhD degree recipients in STEM fields only. And then the Survey of Earned Doctorates, which is an annual census of all newly minted PhDs across all fields in the United States. It's typically mandated by doctoral institutions to receive a PhD, which leads to a very high response rate of about 92%. And NSF works closely with doctoral institutions and provides them data. So there's a close exchange between doctoral institutions and NSF on the Survey of Earned Doctorates. So these surveys are collected by NSF. NSF generates the WMPD report that we're talking about today, as well as the Science and Engineering Indicators report. And these go to Congress, to policymakers, to the National Institutes of Health, to university diversity offices, to researchers and scientific organizations, and they're absolutely critical. Having sex orientation and gender identity data in these surveys would allow researchers and policymakers to track LGBTQ disparities in STEM and career and educational barriers, including how they might intersect with race and economic background, allow for the development and testing of strategies to increase the retention of LGBTQ people in STEM if and where there are leakages in the pipeline, help universities, funding agencies, and scientific societies prevent and stop bias and pipeline issues, inform NSF and NIH diversity initiatives directly in terms of the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, National Research Service Awards, which rely on these very data and these surveys to set diversity initiatives, and help change the conversation in STEM more broadly. The fact that this information is included in official surveys and reports helps to change the conversation such that LGBTQ identity is a recognized form of STEM diversity. So given the importance of these data, I, for the past 3 years, have been leading an effort urging the National Science Foundation and the White House Office of Management and Budget, which has to approve NSF's changes to its surveys, to include sex orientation and gender identity demographic questions on these surveys. This was supported by 17 major scientific organizations, including FABBS, AAAS, and the American Educational Research Association. And AAAS and ARA have been tremendous collaborators on this work since 2018, and we're continuing to encourage NSF and OMB to include these questions. And so back in 3 years ago, in 2018, NSF indicated that they would indeed begin piloting these questions on their national workforce surveys. Unfortunately, due to limited time and resources that NSF and NCSES had, they delayed the piloting for 2.5 years, but it's just starting as of last month, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in a moment. Since this time, since 2018, there has been a National Academies report on the well-being of LGBTQI+ populations, which explicitly recommended that NSF add sex orientation and gender identity, or SOGI, demographic questions to its surveys. And so what I want to talk about now is the feasibility in implementing these questions on NSF surveys. So first, SOGI questions have strong federal precedents, right? So major federal surveys have been collecting SOGI data for several years now, like the Current Population Survey, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System Survey. So very large surveys conducted by the US government on the US population for several years without issue. This has been highly beneficial and highly feasible. SOGI questions are voluntary. There's no personal mandate to respond. The privacy and confidentiality of personally identifiable data in NSF surveys are strongly protected by federal law, and so respondents cannot be identified or exposed to discrimination. NSF, NCSES, and the US Census Bureau suppress data cells with too few respondents to prevent possible identifiability or disclosure. So going through great lengths to make sure that respondents can't be identified. And generally, experience shows that respondents react very favorably to SOGI questions in federal surveys. They elicit fewer sensitivity reactions than other commonly measured questions like income and disability. So I want to give you a quick case study on the federal statistical agency that's probably the most comparable and closest to NSF, National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics. So in 2012, NCES recognized the need to introduce SOGI measures wherever possible in national education surveys. In 2015, NCES conducted piloting, which revealed that the questions were very feasible, didn't present any issues. And in 2016, they introduced these questions into national surveys of high schoolers and college graduates, which were highly beneficial and didn't cause any issues. So let's get into it for a moment in terms of the actual data. So this is the 2016 follow-up to the 2009 high school longitudinal study of 23,000 high school freshmen initially assessed in 2009. And what federal statistical agencies are often looking in terms of, is this too personal? Is this too sensitive? Is this causing an issue for respondents? Are break-off rates in terms of when respondents see the question and they decide to exit the survey altogether because presumably they're uncomfortable. Item non-response rates, meaning that they skip the question because presumably they didn't want to answer it. Or how long it takes to complete the question, which might suggest sensitivity, might suggest undue cost or burden. And what you're looking at is demographic questions of assigned sex at birth, gender identity, sex orientation, income, and disability. And across the board, you're seeing that birth, sex, gender identity, and sex orientation are all eliciting, are taking, less time to respond and are eliciting fewer sensitivity reactions than other commonly measured questions, namely income and disability, right? So even on the federal statistical agency that's closest to NCSES, we're seeing back already in 2016 that there's really no issues whatsoever. If anything, income and disability are causing more issues than assigned sex at birth, gender identity, and sex orientation. So these are very feasible questions to ask respondents. So finally, NCSES at NSF has begun piloting SOGI questions as of last month, which I think I can certainly say on behalf of my colleagues at AAAS and the American Educational Research Association, certainly myself, we are thrilled that NCSES sees the importance of this issue and has begun to pilot these questions, and we want to do everything we can to help NCSES move along. So I'm going to tell you quickly about the two studies NSF is currently conducting. It's currently conducting an online convenience sample of 2,800 respondents to test effects of, are there any effects of the order in which responses are provided to respondents, or the ordering of the questions as they're presented to respondents, as well as follow-up questioning about, do the respondents understand the questions? Are they comfortable with the questions? Do they feel that the response accurately captured how they feel about these identities? And you're seeing these are questions of sex orientation and gender identity that have been used in some of the major federal surveys I discussed earlier, like the current population survey. And one thing I want to note, you're seeing with gender identity, there's a question about their current gender identity, as well as assigned sex at birth. And this is referring to the two-step gender identity method, which we specifically advocated to NSF NCSES to pilot and implement on its surveys. Because, and the way that this works is that respondents are marked as gender identities if they describe themselves as either transgender or if they report an assigned birth sex that's different from their current gender identity. And the reason for this is that surveys that simply expand a binary sex question to add a transgender or non-binary option generally undercount the transgender population, identifying roughly 5 times fewer gender minority respondents than this two-step method. The National Center for Education Statistics also revealed that this method is least confusing to respondents. So we're very pleased that NCSES has heeded our call in implementing or at least piloting the two-step approach. The NCSES is also conducting, as part of the National Survey of College Graduates this year, on 5,000 respondents, a nationally representative non-production panel. So it doesn't make its way into the WMPD report, but it's nationally representative. It's carefully sampled, which is being used to assess the likely disclosure risk of the LGBTQ population, break-off and non-response rates, and time spent on SOGI questions. And you're noticing here that NCSES has decided to use sort of expanded options where they can select all that apply, and including questions like asexual, pansexual, or fluid, and gender nonconforming, or gender fluid, or gender queer. And when we look at the sex orientation measure for a moment, and we see these expanded options, when we look at other recent federal surveys, I'm showing you one here that use the exact same question we had in the previous study. NCSES is using a more traditional sex orientation measure. For those who mark themselves as something else with a write-in, only 1.5% of respondents are using that something else. And among those write-ins, only 16% are using options that can be classified as a sexual minority, which means that roughly 0.24% of respondents seem to be preferring to use these expanded options. So what I imagine NCSES is looking at here is that 0.24% of respondents that prefer to use these kind of pansexual, queer, or fluid options above and beyond the provided options in these more traditional sex orientation measures. Is that providing important information that reduces measurement error? But also what you have to recognize is that these responses can't be unduly confusing, especially to non-sexual minorities, heterosexual respondents. And so this careful balancing is what I imagine NCSES is doing. About disclosure risk and identifiability, I really want to stress that current estimates of the LGBTQ population in the US is 5.6%, as I mentioned earlier. NCSES has long been collecting information on racial and ethnic categories that are far smaller than the LGBTQ population. So Asians, American Indians, and Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders all have a far smaller prevalence in the US population than LGBTQ people. So risks of identifiability or disclosure should not be a major concern for LGBTQ people. And so hopefully this piloting confirms that. Now, NCSES's pilot studies are geared toward implementation on the National Survey of College Graduates. NCSES has indicated to us that additional work would be needed to add SOGI questions to other surveys, like the Survey of Earned Doctorates, which again is the annual census of all newly minted PhDs in the United States across all fields, not just STEM. Now, this is typically mandated by doctoral institutions, which results in its very high response rate. NCSES indicates that because of the large number of temporary visa holders, there might need to be cross-cultural testing. Also, critically, personally identifiable data is provided back to doctoral institutions as part of this kind of mandating that their doctoral students take this survey. So privacy and informed consent statements might need revision. And while I certainly understand the need, these methodological issues, certainly, I really want to stress to NCSES and to policymakers that might be watching that, here's a recent, this was April 28th, but a doctoral student who just graduated honestly cannot believe that these are the only options in a mandatory NSF survey I just had to take, no less, when they have an entire Office of Diversity and Inclusion. We need our scientific institutions to do better than this, and there's only binary sex options. And I want to stress that this very high response rate, which is necessary, could go down if NCSES does not act quickly, because respondents are finding that this is a very constraining question that is inconsistent with their own diversity commitments. And also doctoral institutions that mandate this in terms of graduate deans might take issue with mandating this survey if NCSES's response options are not consistent with the diversity commitments of those institutions of higher education. And so I really want to try to urge NSF NCSES to try to work on this in parallel and act quickly on this. Finally, just want to note that there's the possibility of even federal-wide SOGI data standards. So race and ethnicity federal data collection is standardized by an OMB policy directive. And there's two initiatives right now that could lead to federal-wide SOGI data standards. One is President Biden's executive order on equity, which established an interagency equitable data working group tasked with improving federal data collection to better capture the diversity of the American people. Another is that there's a National Academies consensus study on measuring sex, gender identity, and sex orientation for the NIH, which could make OMB policy recommendations, which could standardize the collection of sex orientation and gender identity in federal surveys broadly, which then NSF would follow. But we're very pleased. We hoped NCSES could have worked on this, got started 3 years ago, but we're very pleased and grateful that they're working on it now. And we are grateful that they're working on it, regardless of the possibility of federal-wide standards. It's absolutely critical that NSF start to add these questions. And I think there's an urgency to it. And I think many in the US STEM community agree with that. So with that, I just want to thank especially leadership at AAAS and the American Educational Research Association for their incredible collaboration and support on this issue, as well as Adam Romero, Laura Dorso, Christina Olson, and David Miller. And looking forward to discussion and answer questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Tremendously informative. Adrienne, Michael, you ready? We're going to wait till the end for questions.
Okay, so I just want to thank everyone for inviting Michael and I here today. And we're so excited to be talking about these issues. I just want to also acknowledge Melissa Wittko, who she and I have, as Sandra mentioned, recently published some work on why we think developmental researchers should be excited about studying multiracial youth. And we recently wrapped a special issue, co-editing a special issue on biracial, multiracial, and multi-ethnic youth for the Journal of Early Adolescence. I also want to acknowledge Sarah Gaither, who graciously shared some of her notes with us. And I want to just point out that all the points that we're making today largely overlap with what her notes suggested, and importantly, none overlap. So the starting point for our talk is really that diversity in STEM is important because it can, both empirical and theoretical work suggests that it can help us address some of the most pressing and challenging questions of our time. And by diversity, we really think about the degree to which people with different experiences, life experiences, perspectives, unique skills, and knowledge can come together and bring those diverse experiences to the table to address these problems. So with that, I'll turn over to Michael.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Adrienne. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm very excited to be able to discuss this topic today, since, as Adrienne mentioned, multiracial populations are growing and have so much to offer in terms of their unique experiences and perspectives, especially in regards to STEM education and STEM research. That is to say, if diversity in STEM can help us to address some of the nation's largest challenges, then it's critical that we be able to accurately represent and capture the incredible diversity within multiracial populations. And this push towards understanding multiracial populations and experiences is also incredibly timely. right? There's a national conversation happening right now about what it means to be both multiracial and to be able to support multiracial populations, especially the youth population and students and children. Capturing accurate demographics then is key, because so many institutions and schools look to this demographic information to help determine things like financial support and aid and resource allocation for underrepresented groups. And as one of the fastest growing demographics in the US, this obviously has huge implications for the multiracial population. So what are some of the major challenges that we find in incorporating multiracial demographics in STEM? Dr. Nishina and I identified just 3 conceptual and 3 methodological challenges, although there are others. So these are what we're going to discuss today, some barriers for us to think about. So a first challenge is whether and how to distinguish multiracial as a racial minority category or as an underrepresented racial minority category. Looking at the 2019 WMPD report, first of all, we see that multiracial individuals are referred to as those who select more than one race for their racial background. From there, they define an ethnic racial minority as a racial or ethnic group that is a small percentage of the US population. And they specifically highlight Blacks and African Americans, Hispanics and Latinos, American Indians and Native Hawaiians, and Alaska Natives, Asians, and also multiracial individuals, or individuals who select more than one race. They then distinguish underrepresented minorities as those minority groups whose STEM representation in education or employment is smaller than their national representation. And it's important to note that there they only refer to Blacks and African Americans, Hispanics and Latinos, or American Indians and Alaska Natives, not multiracial individuals. So you can imagine a situation where an individual is, for example, African American and Hispanic Latino, 2 individual categories that are considered underrepresented minorities, but because they are multiracial, they may not be considered an underrepresented minority. So when we're considering things like resource allocation and the support and highlight that underrepresented minorities get, particularly in STEM fields, it's important for us to remember that that may not be capturing multiracial individuals, regardless of what their ethnic racial categories are, and if those particular categories on their own would be considered underrepresented. A second conceptual challenge that is near and dear to my heart surrounding multiracial demographics is that of the Latinx category, referred to in the report as Hispanic or Latino. So this label is meant to capture a large pan-ethnic group, as we know. And in the report's demographic information, individuals are categorized as either Hispanic or Latino or not. In terms of the multiracial population, this leads to 2 questions. First, it's a little unclear in this kind of reporting whether identifying as Hispanic or Latino and another distinct ethnic racial group would mean that the individual is considered multiracial or not. And second, more broadly, is whether we are capturing in this kind of reporting the lived experiences of multiracial Hispanics and Latinos by making this kind of distinction in the first place. I'll speak about myself, for example. I am multiracial, but I'm also Latino, Puerto Rican. And for the majority of my life, that label of Latino was both my ethnic and my racial identifier. I didn't make the distinction. So as we consider what it means in academia to be multiracial and to be Hispanic and Latino, we should also keep in mind what it means for Latinx individuals in their daily lives, and whether they consider being Hispanic and Latino as an ethnic label, a racial label, part of a multiracial label or not. A third conceptual challenge, which somewhat subsumes the others, is whether the multiracial label does or should refer to a single pan-racial group, or whether we should be more nuanced at looking at specific subgroups. For example, the 2010 census identified 3% of the population roughly as multiracial, which, by the way, in the next few decades is projected to go up to 10%. It's a huge, huge population that we're referring to here. That said, within that 3%, there's incredible variation. When we look at the data more broadly, we see that more than 50 subgroups were identified, each a different combination of ethnic racial categories selected by individuals who took the census. I know in my own research, when we used some additional racial categories that the census didn't use, like breaking apart the Asian American Pacific Islander categories, adding an AMENA category, we had over 60 subgroups of adolescents reporting themselves as multiracial. So we can certainly imagine situations when looking at the multiracial population as a single group would be very meaningful. But when we don't consider some of these nuances that we're seeing, we may be missing out on potential differential STEM outcomes and opportunities for different subgroups. Now, if you're like me and you're interested in what subgroups are the most prominent, we can kind of zoom in there and see that in 2010 anyway, 4 of the subgroups made up over 70% of individuals who reported having 2 races. There are other individuals reporting 3 or more, but if we just look at the 2 races, individuals identifying as either white and Black, American Indian and Alaska Native, Asian, or some other race made up a huge portion of the multiracial respondents. So we can see that there are subgroups that independently are large enough to be studied on their own, but all of the subgroups, for the most part, most of the 50 subgroups were increasing in population from 2000 to 2010, suggesting it's becoming more and more important for us to consider those nuances when we talk about the label of multiracial. Now we're going to talk about some methodological challenges with Adrienne.
Great. Okay. So the first step that we have to take when we think about including multiracial individuals and demographics is that to really make sure that they're included in the count, so in the metrics. And so we took a step back and we looked at the top 30, the most STEM majors in the country based on National Center of Education statistics. And we looked at how they're kind of identifying their student population. So we found that almost a third of participants, or a third of these top schools didn't mention multiracial at all in their student demographics. Another 50% used terminology that reflected multiracial in some way. So 2 or more races would be closest to how NSF was defining it in the report. Multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multiracial minority or multiracial majority. And then the remaining 20% had much more vague terms that we're assuming multiracial might be included under, so other, unknown, minority, or diversity. So, without inclusion in the metrics, we can't really get a good sense, as Michael mentioned, about whether multiracial individuals are indeed underrepresented within STEM or not, and without inclusion and without consistency in measurement. The next methodological issue that I want to talk about is the idea that, and just like in all research, the item and the way we phrase the item, as well as the response scales we use, can impact how participants respond. So I'm just going to give a quick illustration from Victoria Maurer and colleagues, where they had a survey where they asked a multiracial question in 2 different ways and had early adolescents self-report on their racial backgrounds. And so one was just kind of a checklist. So much like the census, it's kind of check all that apply. And then the second question was, are you biracial? Is it just a dichotomous question, yes or no? And using those 2 items, they found that about a little more than 10% of their sample would be considered biracial or multiracial. But an additional 5% of their sample indicated that checked multiple racial categories, but said no, they were not biracial. And then a further 10% of their sample said that they were biracial, but only checked a single monoracial category from the list. So you can see that depending on how we measure multiracial, member status, this particular study could have had between 5% to up to 26% of the sample being reflected as multiracial. I should also note that it wasn't just a measurement error based on the fact that these were early adolescents, because the authors also asked the parents of these participants what their child's race, ethnicity were, and the results were very similar to that. The final methodological challenge that I want to talk about is that multiracial status itself, based on self-report, it can be fluid over time and across contexts. So we know that multiracial individuals are likely to shift their multiracial status between multiracial and sometimes one of their monoracial backgrounds across time. This can be related to normative identity development or identity exploration across development. But we also know that the responses of multiracial individuals might shift as a function of context. So for example, participants might be more likely to acknowledge their multiracial background if they're around their family members in the family context, and they can see people they're primed by, the people from different backgrounds. But then when they transition into their STEM major at their university, they might tend to identify as monoracial, especially if their university doesn't even recognize multiracial as a status. And then, as they transition into the STEM fields, depending on the degree to which diversity is valued within their workplace and among colleagues, they may or may not continue to identify as multiracial. So, of course, this poses a challenge in understanding the representation of multiracial demographics within STEM. But we want to argue that it should not be an insurmountable barrier, that we shouldn't continue to use other as a category and kind of catch-all to include multiracial individuals. And we can no longer really afford to do so, given the rapid increase in the demographic within the US population. So we provide a couple recommendations for the future. One is kind of to really think about how multiracial status can benefit diversity within STEM majors and within the STEM field as a whole. And the degree to which these unique experiences and perspectives kind of contribute to diversity will then inform the types of measurements we use to collect multiracial status. We personally recommend multiple measurements, although as you saw there, suggests that by collecting multiple measurements, it gives us more flexibility in understanding understanding the outcomes for this group of individuals. And then finally, we encourage everyone to just clearly articulate how you're operationalizing multiracial status in your own work. And I think this will help us to better understand the demographic moving forward. Okay, and so I just want to end with some acknowledgements and thanks, and I will turn it back to Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne and Michael. Two great presentations. All this work going on with LGBTQ and NSF, they need to do the same thing with different ways of studying and modeling being multiracial. So we have a few minutes for about 15, 14 minutes for questions. Are people putting them in the chat? Julianne, help. Julianne was supposed to be helping with.
I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but I'll keep monitoring. There has been some discussion and a couple people who have put comments. I don't know if there was a comment. There's quite a lot of discussion actually from Christopher Barnhart. I don't know if you wanted to give a little update on NIH activities, Chris?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
So yeah, we are commissioning this study. I think that it was kind of touched on in the first presentation, but NIH is actively working to develop standardized measures for sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex collection. And we're very much looking forward to putting that forward to the OMB and moving that forward into collection of data at all levels, including clinical, administrative, and research workforce. So we're very hopeful that will happen. It's been a dream of ours for some time, and we will definitely keep you updated as it unfolds.
Thank you, Christopher. I believe Elizabeth has a question. Elizabeth, you want to unmute yourself?
I have a question.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Shirley.
Yes. I just wanted to raise an issue because thinking about the LGBTQ plus data and this whole question of identity, we don't ask questions about identity in the multiracial category. And yet identity is a major issue. And in the sense of not just what would somebody else characterize you? What do you characterize yourself as being? And where might somebody else place you? And that makes a big difference in terms of a bias, in terms of the way that people may relate to you. So the not asking identity makes a lot of sense for LGBTQ populations, but asking identity also makes a lot of sense for racial ethnic groups as well. I think that because the lived experience, and this is especially going to be important when you start looking at health related data, because the whole question about the lived experience and the kinds of things that may impact health disparities that I think that you've got to somehow take into account.
Great point. A brief response from either presenter? It's probably more comment about the importance of asking about identity and identification than a question. So I'm going to ask a question while you're thinking about Shirley's. So it's an intersectional question, and I think this is a challenge even when you're just focusing on the identities that the report has historically up till now focused on. So with LGBTQ, how do you decide? Is it important to know whether that person is or those that group is also a member of an underrepresented group? Is that double counting or single counting? And if you're multiracial, multi-ethnic, is it important to know whether you're also a person with a disability? How do we begin to take a more intersectional approach so that we can understand really the extent of the concerns that we have about underrepresentation?
I can start. Yeah, it's such a great point. Of course, without sexual orientation or gender identity collected at all, there's no ability to understand intersectional issues for LGBTQ people. But the studies that exist, Erin Seck has conducted work, who's speaking at 4 p.m. today on over 25,000 STEM professionals, and found some evidence for negative workplace experiences, career barriers that LGBTQ people of color face in particular. But there's also, and then there's subgroup issues in terms of trans individuals or gender minorities facing different kinds of issues than sexual minorities. But also this can happen in these unexpected ways that isn't just about sort of multiple marginalization. So for example, sexual minority men seem to be, when you look at federal surveys like the National Health Interview Survey or the American Community Survey, are facing considerable underrepresentation relative to heterosexual men, even when you control for a bunch of factors. But that's not the case for sexual minority women. And there's been a lot of work on masculine STEM cultures which marginalize women, heterosexual women. And it seems, one possibility is that stereotypes about sexual minority men, which often focus on femininity, actually deter the entry and retention of sexual minority men in STEM. Whereas for sexual minority women, because stereotypes their stereotypes are more consistent with masculine STEM cultures, they wind up, if anything, a little bit overrepresented, which some data suggests. So my only point is that it's intersectional issues, it's subgroup issues, and it can happen in complicated ways that isn't just kind of, let's add up the identities related to, you know, stigma and marginalization. So it only, I think, emphasizes why we need real official nationwide data. Yeah.
And the numbers are there, as both of you have indicated, the percentages of people who fall into these understudied groups. Adrienne, Michael, did you want to have a comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to kind of circle back to Shirley's point, because I think there were two really important things there. One is just how the individual perceives themselves. So in some cases, research has used kind of this, you know, how do you most strongly identify, as to try to capture that. But I think that is sometimes disentangled from your other point, which I think is so important to remember, is that the individual doesn't always have control over how others perceive them, and that all of the bias and discrimination and those sorts of experiences, not only in STEM but in society, come from the perception of others. So in some cases, in some of our work with Sandra, we've asked, you know, what do, when we look at high school students, you know, what do most of your classmates perceive you to be, to get a snapshot of, you know, what, especially for multiracial, what they might be perceived as, and how that might differ from how they see themselves. So I think it's such an important thing to think about.
It is. So there was a question from Ashley. This may be the last, well, we'll see. Ashley Robbins.
Yes, my question was in regards to the job discomfort and the low retention rate in STEM careers. Is this unique to STEM careers, or is this common in the LGBT community across industries? And is there any data that we can compare STEM to?
Great question. Other fields, humanities. Professional schools? It's a great question. Maybe we don't know, maybe we need to gather the data. So maybe we should hold off on that. Other questions while you're thinking about that? That's a data gathering question. Other questions?
I'll make one comment about sample size.
Okay, Elizabeth.
I just want to remind people that we are talking about, yes, I know we're talking about 5% or 6% of the total population, but these are still fairly small samples. And we just have to keep that in mind. Not that I'm saying that we shouldn't collect data on them, but I think we have to remember that how much information we can get about these various groups are going to be dependent on the size of the population, the size of the sample. So when you're looking at the Census Bureau with, you know, like the American Community Survey with, you know, over 1 million households in the sample each year, it's going to be a lot different than, say, something of the sample size for the Survey of Earned Doctorates or the National Survey of College Graduates. So I just want people to keep in mind that when we're talking about even NCSES surveys, even as big as they are, you're still going to have a smaller portion of a relatively small sample size. So when we do get SOGI questions on these surveys, there may be some limitations about what you're going to get from the data. And that's just going to be the same limitations we get, for example, when we can't break up the information by certain racial and ethnic groups just because they're small groups. Another thing I want to mention, and I just want to bring this to your attention to think about, especially in the next couple of years, at the Census Bureau, there has been a lot of work around differential privacy and making sure that data, the information that people give to the Census Bureau is kept confidential. And so they're producing a lot of different methods. Well, I can't say a lot of different methods. They're working on differential privacy methods that protect people. That will tend to put noise in the data. And so for smaller groups and for smaller groups and also for groups in smaller geographies, this can affect the estimates. So it's nothing that I just want to put that out there because this is the area that you guys are interested in. You're interested in smaller groups and getting data. It's just something to keep in mind going forward, because as the census goes, other federal statistical agencies go. So if they are going to start applying differential privacy to their surveys, right now they're applying it only to the census. They're working to apply it to the ACS in the next 5 years. Once they figure out the math and the methodologies to apply it to the ACS, it'll more likely be applied to other surveys as well. This could affect things. So just keep that in mind.
I mean, that's a caveat, of cautionary note. But did anybody, either John or Adrienne and Michael, want to briefly respond to that?
Yeah, because there was discussion on this issue in the chat window too. Just to remind everyone, NCSES suppresses data cells that have too few respondents as to prevent identifiability and disclosure, right? As you know, NCSES is mandated to collect the same racial and ethnic category classifications through OMB. So they're collecting things and they have to do it. And if the answer is, let's not do it, the answer is, okay, we need to assess the disclosure risk and then suppress those data cells because it risks identifiability. But the data are absolutely collected. They're mandated by OMB, right? So my only point is that I think the methodological concerns are absolutely there, and NCSES must do the work, but they don't need to delay for 3 years, for example, and delay any further because this is such a grandiose task. I think it has experience in doing this with far smaller sample sizes, right? 5.6% of the US population identifies as LGBTQ, and that's more like 10% among 18 to 37 years of age. So when we're talking about the survey of earned doctorates and something like probably 10% of the US population, I don't really think of that as a major issue, right? So I absolutely hear the concern methodologically, but my only point is just the answer is, in my view, not don't collect the data. It's let's find out what we need to suppress, but we can do things in the aggregate. Let's get whatever we can, but without risking, of course, identifiability.
Adrienne, Michael, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, just briefly, just a really good point to consider from Elizabeth. And also we should consider how fluid a lot of this data would be, as we touched on a little bit in our presentation, but I think is also relevant for John's presentation. The responses that individuals are going to give about their social identities and their identity beliefs are likely to vary across contexts, depending on when they give their responses, what environment they're giving the responses with, the context in which they're giving that data. Is it to a person or is it electronic? We're kind of chasing a moving target with things like multiracial identity and gender identity in a lot of cases, especially when we're dealing with younger populations where some of that might still be getting worked out. So sample size is a real concern, as is understanding the context in which the data is collected, which is why we so strongly advocate getting multiple reporters, collecting data in multiple circumstances, and understanding that these things are likely to change over time, and to keep that in mind when we're considering how to allocate resources and how we interpret the demographic information.
So I think the take-home message is there are challenges to studying LGBTQ populations and multiracial youth, especially the fluidity of multiracial identification, especially in the adolescent and young adult years, but challenges that are not unsurmountable. And so I think that's the message of today. And I think it's the hour is over, and unfortunately we have to sign off, but it's been a great presentation. Thanks to the presenters, thanks to the audience.